It shouldn't really work. Take a game released in 2011 and later upgraded and improved in 2014, a game that still, at this point in time, is receiving DLC packs and garnering huge amounts of players. Take that game and then deconstruct it. Wind the memory requirements all the way back down to a 48K spectrum and put across as much of the spirit of the game that inspired it as possible. It shouldn't really work, but it kind of does. Now, don't get me wrong, no one is going to delete Steam and stop playing Ed McMillen's beloved roguelite and instead opt for the Inding of Baasic? Look, I don't really get the title at all, but anyway, it's not going to be a straight swap, but it is a worthy little look at someone taking something they love and trying their best to boil that complex gameplay down into a tiny space. It's like taking the Mona Lisa and trying to hand draw the same thing onto a postage stamp using leftover hummus or something. Once again, it shouldn't really work, but here it is in all its hummus-based postage stamp glory. For those who don't dabble in games released after 1993, The Binding of Isaac is an indie roguelike that blasted onto the scene at a time when indie games weren't quite taken in the same stride as they are now. This was an era when commercialized indie gaming was beginning to take a foothold, with games like World of Goo and McMillen's other classic, Super Meat Boy, bringing something fresh to the table that AAA development often lacked. Let's focus on the remake of The Binding of Isaac, however, because the original is now largely abandoned due to it being built out of crepe paper and string, or in technical terms, Flash. To truly do everything he wanted to do with the series, he rebuilt Isaac from the ground up, giving us Rebirth in 2014, and as previously mentioned, releasing DLC packs all the way up to the current year, featuring new ways to win, new ways to die, and a whole heap of content. The goals in Isaac are pretty wide-ranging once you take all the expansions into account, but the basic gist is this. A randomly generated dungeon is created. You, as either Isaac or one of the many other unlockable characters, traverse the dungeon, shooting tears at enemies using dual analog controls in the same way as something like Smash TV. There's also a lot of poop. Explaining the visuals would take an entire video in itself, so just accept that there is a lot of poop. Fight your way through a series of dungeons, kill every enemy in a room, and work your way towards one of the final bosses. On each level, you'll find a shop where you can buy items, a treasure room where you'll pick up an object that gives Isaac new powers, and a final room with a boss. There's secrets to be found by bombing walls, there's synergies to be discovered in the items you uncover, and there's a lot of dying, especially if you're not particularly good at the game. I'm not particularly good at the game, but that's beside the point. I am a huge fan of The Binding of Isaac. I was, therefore, fully expecting the demake of Isaac on the ZX Spectrum to be absolute gash. Instead, I came away with a permanent grin on my face. Not because it's particularly perfect, it's not, there are issues with it, but the idea that someone would even attempt this at all is such a daft idea that I couldn't help but fall in love with this twee adaptation. Built in Boreal's ZX Basic and looking exactly like you'd expect for a game built in Basic, the developer here, Crappy Games, has focused on providing as much of the core experience as possible, and it's pretty amazing how much has actually been squeezed into this. We have randomly generated dungeons, we have bombs that you can use to blow up rocks or find secret rooms, we have a control scheme that will feel completely foreign to most ZX Spectrum enthusiasts, but one that emulates the original as closely as possible, with dual analogs set to the keyboard using WASD for movement and IJGL for shooting, or if you're a loosey lefty, you can swap those around. There is also a simplified controls version of the game in which you just shoot wherever you're looking, but it's certainly not something I had any issues with. There are treasure rooms with items that bear no description whatsoever, and this is both exactly like the original and also probably where a bit more could be done to make things clearer to the player. There's not a lot of room for visual flair in this demake, and often you'll pick up an item and spend the next 5 minutes wondering what the hell it's actually doing before you just die. In the original Binding of Isaac, there's usually some small tell, or big tell depending on the item, that gives you an indication as to what it's done. After playing Inding of Baasic, whatever, for a while now, I think I could count the number of items I understood on one hand. That being said, the items themselves aren't lifted wholesale from the original, with references to other Spectrum titles like Manic Miner or Bombjack. It adds a nice knowing nod to the system it's being shipped to. Shops are here, although pared down massively compared to the original. It's basically a room that you can come in and out of to find different items for sale. Useful if you need some health in a pinch. Boss rooms equally are here, although, again, comparing the bosses in this remake to those of the original game is like comparing Space Invaders to Call of Duty and complaining that they don't play the same. As with the bosses, enemies in general have been simplified here, usually following a set pattern, but all with knowing nods to the creations that inspired it. The trick here is to know when to position yourself for an attack before moving into position, and the other trick is to not immediately forget that and get yourself killed. While enemy patterns don't match those found in the original game, the spirit is the same, and that is the overarching takeaway here. This is not the Binding of Isaac. It was never going to be the Binding of Isaac. It shouldn't really work. But we have poops, and we have bonfires, we have grotesque monsters, but most of all, we have that spirit of the original that inspired it. With 8 levels total and the replayability offered by random dungeons, this is a genuinely impressive love letter to its big brother. And it's not only one that fans of Ed McMillen's scatological escapades should check out, it's a genuinely fun, challenging little shooter, regardless of whether you have any prior experience with its inspiration.